Welcome back to Sleep Story, where we journey into the darkest corners of the unknown, exploring mysteries that challenge everything we think we understand about reality. Tonight, we travel to a remote stretch of land in northern Utah, a place that has been called many things: a paranormal hotspot, a supernatural epicenter, a window into another dimension. Some have even described it, only half-jokingly, as a Disneyland of the impossible, though the attractions here are far from amusing. As you settle into your bed, let your body relax completely. Feel the tension drain from your shoulders, from your jaw, from every muscle. Tonight's story will carry you through one of the most extensively documented cases of high strangeness in modern history, a tale so bizarre that it has turned the heads of even the most dedicated skeptics. This is the story of a place where the impossible happens with disturbing regularity, where cattle vanish without a trace, where objects defy the laws of physics, where things from somewhere else seem to have established a permanent foothold in our world. This is the story of Skinwalker Ranch. It has been said by researchers, investigators, and longtime residents alike that Utah, particularly the northern region encompassing the Uinta Basin, represents one of the most active paranormal and supernatural hotspots anywhere on the planet. The phenomenon is not subtle or isolated. It is widespread and persistent, woven into the very fabric of the region's history and culture. Everything from unidentified lights performing impossible maneuvers in the sky to weird humanoid figures stalking through scrubland to massive, hair-covered creatures matching descriptions of Bigfoot have been spotted throughout this territory. The accounts are not modern inventions or recent fabrications. They stretch back through generations, a long history of high strangeness that dates to the earliest human settlements in the area. The indigenous peoples of this region, particularly the Ute tribe from whom the basin takes its name, have their own extensive traditions regarding the strange nature of this land. Their stories speak of beings that should not exist, of places where the boundary between worlds grows thin, of creatures that wear skins that are not their own. The statistics, when collected by researchers over the decades, paint a remarkable picture. 3 out of every 4 people living in this part of the state have experienced something they cannot easily explain, something that falls outside the boundaries of ordinary experience. An unusually high number report sightings of aerial phenomena. Others describe encounters with creatures unknown to conventional zoology. Still others speak of experiences that defy categorization entirely. Moments when reality itself seemed to malfunction in localized and deeply unsettling ways. For many others just passing through the region, travelers following the highways that cut through this high desert landscape, there exists a palpable feeling that these dusty roads and bleak vistas hide something of a dark secret. A sense that beneath the surface beauty of red rock and endless sky, something watches and waits. Much of the strange activity researchers have documented is concentrated in and around the Uinta Basin itself, a vast depression formed millions of years ago by geological forces that shaped the surrounding mountains and carved out this distinctive landscape. The basin is bordered by mountain ranges on 3 sides, creating a natural amphitheater that seems to focus and concentrate whatever forces operate here. But some investigators and locals believe that within this broader radius of strangeness, there exists an epicenter, a focal point from which all these bizarre phenomena seem to manifest with particular intensity. That epicenter is a beautiful 480-acre ranch situated approximately 100 miles due east of Salt Lake City, nestled in a valley where cottonwood trees line a meandering creek and green pastures spread between rocky ridges. Under ordinary circumstances, as with any other piece of rural property, the ranch would traditionally adopt the name of its current owner. The Johnson Ranch, the Martinez property, the Wilson Place, simple designations that change with each transfer of deed. But this particular property, over time and through accumulated reputation, has come to be known by another name entirely. A name that reflects its dark heritage and the beliefs of those who lived in proximity to it long before European settlers arrived. The Ute people believed this ranch to be the focal point of a curse, a pathway for something malevolent. According to their traditions, Navajo medicine men had placed this curse long ago as punishment for some transgression now lost to history. The specifics of the original conflict have been obscured by time, but the result was clear and lasting. Tribal members were forbidden from setting foot on this particular piece of land. The prohibition was absolute and enforced through cultural tradition and genuine fear. They believed, and many still believe, that this property lies directly in the path of the Skinwalker, a being from Navajo tradition that represents one of the darkest aspects of their spiritual understanding. The Skinwalker, in these traditions, is not simply a monster or a ghost. It is something far more disturbing, a human who has gained the ability to transform into animal form through the darkest of rituals, who has deliberately chosen to forsake humanity and embrace evil in exchange for supernatural power. For this reason, as stories spread and reputation accumulated over decades, the property became known to locals throughout the region by a name that captured both its beauty and its terror. They called it Skinwalker Ranch. And what happened there in the final years of the 20th century would provide ample justification for that ominous title. Throughout the latter half of the 20th century, during the decades when America was experiencing rapid modernization and the world was being knitted together by new technologies, Skinwalker Ranch was owned by a family which has long remained anonymous in this mysterious saga. Their names have been deliberately withheld from public documentation, protected by mutual agreement among the few researchers who know the full story. This anonymity was not requested out of embarrassment or a desire to avoid attention. Rather, it was requested out of genuine fear of what might happen if they became publicly associated with the property and its phenomena. What is known about this family is limited but telling. They had owned and operated the ranch for many years, raising cattle and living what appeared from the outside to be a normal, if isolated, rural existence. But something happened during their tenure. Something significant enough to drive them away. For reasons they have never publicly disclosed, reasons they refused to discuss even with the family that would later purchase the property from them, they suddenly and inexplicably vacated Skinwalker Ranch in 1987. The departure was not gradual. They did not slowly wind down operations, sell off their herd piece by piece, or make arrangements to lease the land while they transitioned to another location. Instead, they left abruptly, almost as if fleeing, taking only what they could quickly pack and abandoning much of their equipment and household goods. The ranch stood empty and unattended for more than 7 years following their departure. During this period, from 1987 to 1994, the property slowly deteriorated. Buildings fell into disrepair. Fences sagged and collapsed. The land, without regular maintenance, began to return to a wilder state. Local residents avoided the property during these years. Stories circulated about strange lights seen over the abandoned buildings at night. Ranchers whose property bordered the southern edge reported that their cattle refused to graze near the fence line they shared with the ranch. Hunters following game trails would turn back when those trails led onto the property, driven by a feeling they could not quite articulate but could not ignore. The ranch sat empty, slowly decaying, waiting for someone who did not know its reputation or who was willing to overlook that reputation in exchange for a remarkable opportunity. That someone arrived in 1994, in the form of a family named Sherman. Terry and Gwen Sherman, along with their 2 children, believed wholeheartedly that they had found their dream home when they first toured the property in the summer of 1994. Terry was a high-end cattle breeder with a reputation for producing some of the finest stock in the region. His animals commanded premium prices, and his breeding program had been his life's work, built carefully over years of study, investment, and dedication. Gwen worked at a bank in a nearby town and managed the family's finances with the same careful attention Terry applied to his cattle. Their children, whose names have also been kept private to protect them from unwanted attention, were in their early teens. They had grown up in the ranching lifestyle and were looking forward to having more space to explore and more freedom than they'd had at their previous, smaller property. The remote ranch seemed perfect for the family's needs and aspirations. It was bordered to the north by a high ridge which overlooked the property, providing natural protection from harsh winter winds. Below the ridge spread sprawling green pastures, wild thickets of woodland that provided cover and food for wildlife, and a flowing creek that ran through the southern portion of the property, ensuring year-round water access. The entire estate exuded an almost tranquil beauty that was not lost on any member of the Sherman family. Standing on the slight rise where the main house sat, looking out over the land in the golden light of late afternoon, Terry could envision exactly how his breeding operation would develop. The property offered the space, privacy, and security he needed to take what was not only his hobby but his livelihood to the next level. The price, when negotiations concluded, was remarkably favorable. Terry had purchased the ranch for far less than what comparable properties in the region were selling for, well below what he had budgeted for and below what any objective appraisal would have valued it at. When he signed the paperwork in the real estate office, accepting the deed with barely controlled excitement, he wore an expression caught between joy and disbelief. What he now held in the palm of his hand represented his ambition, his prospects, his carefully cultivated dream made real. He could not have known that the land he had just purchased would nearly destroy him. Not just financially, as business ventures sometimes do, but psychologically and spiritually as well. When the Shermans had first viewed the property during their initial tour, before making their offer, they had found the main homestead in a state of disrepair. This was anticipated and expected given the length of time the house had stood empty and exposed to the elements. 7 years of neglect had taken their toll. Paint peeled from the siding, windows were clouded with dust and grime, and the porch boards showed signs of rot. What the family did not expect to find, however, was the sheer amount of security that had been installed throughout the structure. This went far beyond normal rural caution or reasonable precaution against theft. Deadbolts secured seemingly every entry point, not just on the front and back doors, as one would expect, but on interior doors throughout the house. Bedroom doors, closet doors. Even the door to the basement had been fitted with heavy-duty locks on both sides. All of the windows, every single one, had been fitted with specialized locks far more substantial than the simple latches typically found in residential construction. These were serious security measures, the kind usually seen in urban environments with high crime rates, not in isolated rural properties where the nearest neighbor was miles away. At the front and rear entrances, the Shermans also discovered heavy-duty chains attached to huge metal rings that had been embedded directly into the walls on either side of each doorframe. The purpose of these chains was unmistakable. They had been used to secure large, powerful guard dogs in position, forcing any intruder to confront the animals before they could enter. The wear patterns on the chains and the scratches on the floors near the doors suggested these restraints had been in regular use for an extended period. Although slightly unsettled by these peculiarities, by this level of security that suggested genuine fear rather than mere caution, Terry and Gwen ultimately dismissed their concerns. They convinced themselves that the elderly couple who had owned the ranch before them had simply been paranoid and overprotective, perhaps made unreasonably fearful by their isolation and age. The previous owners had seemed rather eccentric during the brief meeting at the real estate closing, after all. Their behavior had been odd in several ways that Terry and Gwen had noted but tried not to judge. In the real estate contract, the previous owners had inserted a number of highly unusual clauses that the Shermans' attorney had flagged as abnormal. For instance, the Shermans were explicitly forbidden from conducting any excavation or digging on the land without prior written approval from the previous owners. Any violation of this clause would result in immediate legal action and potentially the reversal of the sale. This restriction was bizarre. Once property changes hands, the new owners typically have complete freedom to modify, dig, build, or alter the land as they see fit within the bounds of local zoning laws. But the previous owners had insisted on this limitation, had made it a condition of the sale, and had required it to be legally binding. There were other odd restrictions as well. The Shermans were required to notify the previous owners if they experienced any unusual phenomena on the property. They were forbidden from speaking to media about the property or its history without permission. They were required to maintain certain fences and barriers that seemed to serve no practical purpose. These irregularities were noted, discussed, and ultimately overlooked by the Sherman family. They were so eager to secure this beautiful property at such a favorable price that they were willing to accept these strange conditions without pressing for explanations. But somewhere in the back of Terry's mind, in a place he did not examine too closely during those exciting weeks of preparation and moving, he could not help wondering what had spooked the previous owners to the point of installing such extensive security measures. What had they been trying to keep out? Or perhaps more disturbingly, what had they been trying to keep in? In time, of course, he would come to understand with terrible clarity that this idyllic, stunning acreage was haunting in more ways than just its serene beauty. And the weirdness, the absolute impossibility of what they would experience, began almost immediately. In fact, it began on the very first day. On the first day of moving into their new home, a warm afternoon in August 1994, the Sherman family were unloading a rental truck in front of the main house. It was hard, hot work, carrying boxes and furniture up the porch steps and trying to determine where everything should go in rooms they were still learning to navigate. They were tired but happy, energized by the excitement of new beginnings. The children were already planning where they would explore first. Gwen was mentally organizing which rooms would serve which purposes. Terry was calculating how soon he could begin moving his cattle onto the property. It was during a brief pause in their labor, as Terry and his father stopped to drink water and wipe sweat from their faces, that they spotted something emerging from the tree line on the far side of the southern pasture. As it closed the distance between the trees and their position, moving across the open grassland with an easy, loping gait, they could see that it was a wolf. The animal moved in a series of graceful S-curves, approaching them at an angle rather than in a straight line. This movement pattern immediately set Terry on guard, as it suggested intelligence and calculation rather than the straightforward approach of a truly wild animal. But it was not just the presence of the wolf or its approach pattern that concerned him. Scaling its size against distant fence posts and bushes, using those fixed landmarks to estimate the animal's proportions, Terry could see with growing alarm that this creature was enormous, at least 3 times the size of an average wolf. Gray wolves, the largest species in North America, typically weigh between 70 and 120 pounds. This animal appeared to weigh close to 300 pounds, perhaps more. Its shoulders were massive, its head huge and broad, its legs thick with muscle. Yet despite its intimidating size, its behavior was oddly disarming. The wolf did not display the wariness typical of wild predators encountering humans. It seemed nonchalant, almost friendly, as if it were a domestic dog that had wandered over to greet new neighbors rather than a wild animal that should have been keeping its distance. The wolf slowed its approach when it reached a distance of about 50 yards. It stopped completely, sniffed the air with its massive muzzle raised, and gazed at the family with intelligent, piercing blue eyes that seemed to assess and calculate. Then, apparently reaching some decision, it continued its approach, casually padding toward them without any sign of aggression or fear. Its body language suggested complete ease. It wagged its tail slowly. Its ears were forward but relaxed. Every signal indicated a tame, friendly animal. Terry's father, who had driven up from Albuquerque to help with the move, and who stood well over 6 feet tall and had never feared any animal in his long life, bravely reached out to stroke the huge beast as it came within arm's reach. The wolf allowed the contact, even seemed to lean into it slightly. Standing beside Terry's father, a big man by any standard, the animal's head easily came up to the top of his shoulder. If it had reared up on its hind legs, it would have towered over all of them. It quickly became clear to everyone present that despite the wolf's intimidating size and its obvious physical power, it meant no harm. Its demeanor was gentle, almost playful. The family began to relax, their initial wariness giving way to fascination. The children approached cautiously but with growing confidence, reaching out to touch the thick fur. Gwen pulled out her camera to capture this remarkable encounter. Terry found himself smiling despite his confusion about where such a massive, tame wolf could have come from. Maybe it's somebody's pet, Terry ventured, though the suggestion seemed unlikely even as he spoke it. He glanced nervously toward the corral about 70 feet to his left, suddenly aware that he had made a decision that morning that now seemed unwise. Inside the pen stood 4 of his breeding cows and an equal number of their calves. These were valuable animals, representing significant financial investment and years of careful genetic selection. They were clearly troubled by the wolf's presence, shifting restlessly and watching the huge predator with visible anxiety. All except one curious youngster, a calf perhaps 3 months old, which had pressed its head out between the metal bars of the corral fence. The young animal was watching the scene unfold with the fearless interest typical of juveniles who have not yet learned proper caution. Almost as soon as Terry had registered the danger, almost as if his realization had triggered the attack, the wolf exploded into motion. One moment it was standing peacefully among the family, accepting their touches. The next moment it had bounded across the short distance to the corral with shocking speed, moving so fast it was nearly a blur. Before anyone could react or cry out a warning, the wolf's huge jaws clamped around the calf's entire head. The young cow bleated in terror and pain, thrashing wildly as the wolf tried to drag it bodily through the bars of the corral. The angle was wrong, the opening too small, but the wolf pulled with incredible strength, apparently willing to tear the calf apart rather than release its grip. Terry grabbed an axe handle from the back of the rental truck and rushed over, his heart pounding, his mind racing through the implications of losing one of his best calves on the very first day. He brought the wooden handle down hard on the wolf's flanks, beating at its ribcage and hindquarters with all his strength. He kicked at its hind legs, trying to break its balance. The wolf paid no attention whatsoever. It did not release its grip even slightly. It did not turn to defend itself from the blows. It simply continued to pull at the calf, which was now screaming continuously, its eyes rolling white with terror. "Get my magnum!" Terry shouted to his son, desperation making his voice crack. The boy, moving with the quick efficiency of a ranch kid used to emergencies, ran to the truck, grabbed the .357 Magnum revolver from the glove box, and handed it to his father with shaking hands. Terry chambered around and aimed carefully at the wolf's center mass, at its broadside just behind the front leg where the bullet should penetrate vital organs. At this range, less than 3 feet, he could not possibly miss. The shot rang out across the empty pasture, echoing off the ridge to the north. The recoil kicked the heavy revolver up, but Terry immediately brought it back down, ready to fire again. The wolf did not react in any way. It did not stagger. It did not yelp in pain. It did not even flinch at the sound or impact. It simply continued to savage the poor calf as if nothing had happened. Terry stared in disbelief. He knew firearms. He had hunted his entire life, had put down countless animals over the years when necessary. He knew what a .357 Magnum did to living tissue at point-blank range. He knew that very few animals could survive such a shot, and those that did would at minimum show dramatic reaction to the impact and pain. In desperation, he fired again, adjusting his aim to ensure a solid hit. The second shot was as true as the first. Still, the gun seemed to have no effect. After the third shot, delivered directly into the wolf's ribcage where it should have shattered bone and destroyed lung tissue, the animal slowly and almost reluctantly released its grip on the calf. It backed away approximately 10 feet, turned slightly to look at Terry, and simply stood there. The rancher could not believe his eyes. Very few animals on Earth could have survived 3 shots from a .357 Magnum fired at point-blank range. Those that could, perhaps a grizzly bear in the fury of a charge, running on adrenaline, would show obvious wounds. There would be blood. There would be visible injury. But this wolf displayed no wounds anywhere on its coat. Its thick fur showed no blood. No matted patches where bullets had penetrated. No indication whatsoever that it had just been shot 3 times with a weapon capable of dropping a bull elk. The wolf stood there with what Terry would later describe as an unconcerned, almost curious expression, as if contemplating whether to attack the calf for a second time. Terry sensed this intention in the animal's posture and body language. He shouted at his son to retrieve his .30-06 rifle from the house, a heavier weapon with significantly more stopping power than the handgun. The boy sprinted to the house and returned within seconds with the rifle. During this entire time, perhaps 30 seconds, the wolf remained perfectly still, watching Terry with those unsettling blue eyes, making no move to flee or to attack again. Terry raised the rifle, chambered around, and took careful aim at the animal's chest. He almost felt regret as he did so. Despite what had just happened, despite the attack on his calf, there was something magnificent about this creature. Something that seemed almost sacred, though he could not have explained why he felt this way. A deafening shot echoed across the wilderness as he pulled the trigger. The rifle kicked hard against his shoulder. He knew immediately that he had hit his target. He was too experienced a marksman to miss at this distance, and he had aimed for center mass where even a slight deviation would still result in a solid hit. But instead of collapsing to the ground in a heap, as any animal should have done after taking a .30-06 round through the chest, the wolf simply withdrew another 2 yards. It stood looking at an increasingly unsettled Terry, its expression unchanged, its body language still relaxed and unconcerned. Terry worked the bolt action, chambered another round, and fired again. This time he saw a chunk of flesh and fur detach from the animal's side, saw the impact clearly, saw physical evidence that his bullet had struck home. But even this horrific wound did not put the wolf down. It did not collapse. It did not flee in panic. It simply stood there for a few moments longer, as if considering its options. Finally, it took one last unhurried look at the calf, which was now being tended by Gwen while the children watched in shock. The wolf turned slowly and trotted back in the direction it had come from, moving across the pasture toward the tree line with the same casual, loping gait it had used when approaching. Terry was dumbfounded. His father stood beside him, equally stunned, unable to offer any explanation or comment. They both understood that what they had just witnessed was impossible. Terry knew he could not allow a large predator to remain on his land if he intended to run a successful cattle operation. The decision formed immediately. The wolf had to be found and finished. It was clearly wounded, he had seen the flesh tear away, and leaving a wounded animal to suffer was both cruel and dangerous. He called to his teenage son, and the two of them, armed with a rifle and handgun, proceeded to track the wolf. They moved quickly but cautiously, following the obvious path the animal had taken across the pasture. For approximately half an hour, they pursued it, catching occasional glimpses of its massive form as it moved between patches of cottonwood trees and through thickets of scrub. The tracks were clear and easy to follow in the soft earth, massive paw prints that confirmed the animal's extraordinary size. The trail led them through a copse of Russian olive trees, dense and thorny, requiring them to move carefully to avoid the sharp branches. Emerging from the trees on the far side, they found themselves on the bank of the creek that marked the southern boundary of the property. Before them stretched a wide, open mudbank, exposed where the creek had receded from its spring high water mark. The mud was soft and deep, the kind that would clearly hold any tracks made across its surface. They could clearly see the wolf's paw prints leading from the tree line out onto the mudbank. The impressions were deep and distinct, showing every pad and claw. Terry and his son began to follow them, moving slowly across the unstable surface, their eyes fixed on the tracks. But the trail abruptly stopped approximately 40 yards from the water's edge. Not at the water. Not at the tree line on the opposite side. Not at any boulder or feature where the tracks might logically end. They simply stopped in the middle of the open mudbank, as if the wolf had ceased to exist mid-stride. Terry and his son stood motionless, staring at the final paw print. They searched the entire area, examining the mud in all directions, looking for any explanation. The mudbank extended another 40 or 50 yards in each direction before reaching solid ground or vegetation. For the wolf to have left the mudbank without leaving tracks, it would have had to leap an impossible distance to reach the nearest solid ground. No animal, regardless of size or strength, could make such a jump. And there was nowhere to jump to, no overhanging trees, no rocks, no structures of any kind. The wolf had seemingly vanished into thin air, defying every law of physics and logic. The two of them stood there in the afternoon heat, flies buzzing around them, the sound of the creek gurgling nearby, trying to process what they were seeing. Finally, without speaking, they turned and made their way back toward the homestead. As they walked through the copse of Russian olives, Terry happened to notice something on the ground, a piece of flesh, presumably the chunk that had detached from the wolf during the final shot. He picked it up, intending to examine it more closely once they returned to the house. But even this small piece of evidence was wrong. Rather than being fresh tissue, still warm and covered in blood as it should have been, the flesh looked and smelled rotten. It had the appearance and odor of meat that had been left out in the hot sun for several days, decomposing and putrid. Terry stood there holding the piece of tissue, his mind struggling to fit these observations into any rational framework. A wolf that could not be killed. That left no blood despite being shot multiple times. That vanished without a trace from an open mudbank. That left behind flesh that was already rotting. In quiet contemplation, he turned his head south and looked out over the pasture toward the distant horizon, toward the ridge line that formed the southern boundary of his new property, wondering what on earth had just happened. That was the first day. And it was only the beginning. The next few weeks following the wolf incident were relatively normal, though that normality was punctuated by strange occurrences that happened primarily around the homestead, and most of these seemed specifically targeted toward Gwen. She did not report these incidents to her husband at first. She genuinely thought she might be losing her mind, that the stress of the move combined with the disturbing wolf encounter had somehow affected her perception or memory. The incidents followed a pattern that was both mundane and impossible. For instance, she would return home from shopping in the nearest town, a 40-minute drive each way. She would carry the grocery bags into the kitchen, unpack them methodically, putting each item in its proper place. Canned goods in the pantry, fresh vegetables in the refrigerator, bread and other baked goods in the designated basket on the counter. She would complete this task, double-check that everything was properly stored, and then leave the kitchen to attend to something else, perhaps to fold laundry in the next room or to call the children in for lunch. Moments later, no more than 5 or 10 minutes, she would return to the kitchen and find all the groceries back in their bags, sitting on the counter exactly where she had first placed them when bringing them in from the car, as if she had never unpacked them at all. The first time this happened, she assumed she had simply forgotten to unpack them, that she had been distracted and had only imagined doing so. But she knew this explanation was wrong even as she formed it. She had clear memories of putting each item away. She had opened cabinets, moved things to make room, made specific decisions about placement. When it happened a second time, then a third, she began to seriously question her own mental state. Was she experiencing some form of early-onset dementia? Were there gaps in her memory she was not aware of? Other occurrences were even more disturbing in their specificity and impossibility. She would prepare for her customary morning shower, something she did at the same time every day as part of her established routine. She would enter the bathroom, lock the door behind her out of habit, even though she was often alone in the house during these morning hours. She would place her towel and hairbrush on the counter beside the sink, exactly where she always placed them, within easy reach of the shower. The shower would be normal, unremarkable, a few minutes of hot water and routine cleansing to start her day. But when she finished and pushed aside the shower curtain, she would step out onto the bath mat and find that her towel and hairbrush had vanished. The counter was empty. The items were simply gone. She would search the bathroom frantically, checking the floor, behind the toilet, in the cabinet under the sink. Nothing. Then she would check the door, still locked from the inside, exactly as she had left it. A few hours later, sometimes not until late afternoon, she would find the missing items in some random location elsewhere in the house. The towel draped over a chair in the living room. The hairbrush sitting on the kitchen windowsill. Once, she found them both in the basement on a shelf she knew she had not visited in days. Things continued in this pattern for some time, perhaps 3 or 4 weeks. Gwen was getting increasingly worried about her mental health and her memory. She considered seeing a doctor but hesitated, afraid of what such an evaluation might reveal. The situation changed one evening when Terry came storming into the house from the pasture, frustrated and confused, demanding to know who had taken his post digger. He had been using the tool to repair a fence line in the south pasture, work that needed to be completed before he could safely move more cattle onto the property. He had set the post digger down for a moment while he measured the spacing for the next hole. When he turned back, no more than a minute later, it had vanished. The post digger was not a small item that could be easily misplaced. It was a heavy tool, weighing more than 70 pounds, with long handles and a distinctive shape. It was not something that could be confused with anything else or that could accidentally be moved or hidden. Gwen explained that she and the children had been in the house all evening, that none of them had been anywhere near the south pasture. She could see from Terry's expression that he believed her, but was equally certain about what had happened. Together, the entire family proceeded to help him search for the missing tool. They spent the better part of an hour combing the area where he had been working, expanding their search in widening circles, checking places that made no logical sense but checking them anyway out of desperation. The post digger was nowhere to be found. It would remain missing for several weeks, another mystery added to the growing list of impossible occurrences. Then one morning, Terry's nephew, who had come to stay with them for a few days, was walking through a section of woodland on the eastern edge of the property. He happened to glance up into the branches of a large cottonwood tree and stopped in his tracks, staring upward in confusion. There, suspended impossibly in the upper branches, was Terry's post digger. It was hanging approximately 70 feet off the ground, wedged in the fork where two major branches met. There was no ladder, no rope, no mechanism by which it could have been placed there. And even if someone had managed to carry the heavy tool up into the tree, the question remained, why? What possible purpose could there be? Terry examined the tree carefully, looking for any indication of how the post digger had gotten there. The trunk was too thick to climb easily, and there were no branches low enough to provide initial access. Someone would have needed specialized climbing equipment to reach the location where the tool rested. More significantly, the effort required to retrieve it was substantial. Terry ended up borrowing an extension ladder from a neighbor and spending the better part of an afternoon carefully making his way up into the canopy to retrieve his property. By this time, roughly 6 weeks after moving onto the ranch, the Sherman family was beginning to suspect, though none of them wanted to say it aloud, that something was fundamentally not right about the property they had purchased. About a week before they rediscovered the post digger, an incident occurred that would shift their understanding of the ranch from merely strange to potentially dangerous. Terry's nephew had arrived for his visit, and Terry decided to take the young man on a comprehensive tour of the property. His own son accompanied them, and the three set out in late afternoon, intending to walk the boundaries and show his nephew the full extent of the land. It was well after sunset, probably close to 9 o'clock, when they finally decided to head back toward the homestead. They were approximately a quarter-mile from the house, walking across open pasture under a clear sky thick with stars. A few hundred yards ahead, Terry noticed a set of headlights moving slowly along a distant fence line, well within the boundaries of his property, in an area where there was no road or trail. He had seen similar lights once before, about a week earlier, and had assumed that someone had taken a wrong turn off the county road to the east and had driven onto his land by mistake.